It begins with silence. Not the kind you notice at first, but the kind that fills a room after the headlines fade, when the public has moved on, and the questions linger like smoke in an empty hallway. In the last few decades, a chilling pattern has emerged, not within the shadows of fiction, but beneath the flickering fluorescent lights of boardrooms, courtrooms, and prison cells. Billionaires, inventors, insiders. People who held in their hands the kind of information that could shift public opinion, topple markets, and rupture faith in institutions. They died. Sometimes quickly, sometimes quietly, always conveniently. The official stories are often tidy: suicide, natural causes, tragic accidents. But when you look closer, something doesn't quite fit. A broken bone inconsistent with a fall. A digital trail that goes dark too suddenly. A confession left unsaid, sealed forever. This series is not about conspiracy. It's about patterns. Patterns of power, secrecy, and the price of pulling back the curtain. It's about how certain truths, when too close to exposure, seem to vanish along with the people who carried them. We are not here to prove grand designs or blame faceless institutions. We're here to ask, what happens when knowledge becomes dangerous? When one individual threatens to disrupt billion-dollar empires or expose carefully hidden systems? And why, time and again, do these individuals end up dead? In each of the next 12 chapters, we'll explore the final moments of someone who challenged the system and paid the ultimate price. Some were industry titans. Others were quiet researchers. All had something in common. They stood at the edge of revelation. You'll hear their stories, not as sensational exposés, but as human tragedies. A father who believed in justice. A mother who wanted safer medicine. A tech pioneer who just wanted transparency. Their stories are not theories. They are echoes of something real, and through their lives and deaths, we'll follow a thread that runs deeper than scandal or sabotage. It's the thread of control, of fear, of silence. As we begin this journey, let's be clear, this isn't about knowing all the answers. It's about daring to ask the questions. Why do the people who threaten power so often die before they can speak? What secrets were buried with them? And how many more stories have already vanished before we could even begin to understand them? This is not a detective story. It's not a thriller. It's a documentary told in quiet voices and unfinished thoughts. And it begins with the stillness left behind when someone who knew too much is no longer here to explain. The silence isn't just haunting, it's instructive. The morning sun filtered through the frost-glazed windows of a quiet Toronto mansion. Inside, a housekeeper made a horrifying discovery. Barry and Honey Sherman, one of Canada's wealthiest couples, were lying lifeless near their indoor pool, neatly posed, wrists bound, belts fastened tightly around their necks. The initial headlines were quick to settle. Murder-suicide. A tragic end to a high-profile life. But that version of events unraveled almost as quickly as it was announced. Barry Sherman was no ordinary businessman. He had built Apotex, a generic pharmaceutical empire, by slashing the prices of expensive brand-name drugs, undercutting the profit margins of some of the most powerful pharmaceutical giants on the planet. He was bold, aggressive, and fiercely committed to making medication more affordable. And for that, he had made enemies. Many of them. Behind the polished glass offices and cordial press releases, there were whispers of lawsuits, corporate sabotage, and even death threats. Sherman had been at the center of numerous legal battles, but the one looming largest before his death was a parliamentary hearing. Within 48 hours, he was scheduled to testify about alleged price-fixing schemes that could have implicated major pharmaceutical corporations in a decades-long manipulation of global drug costs. According to recovered files from his computer, Barry had compiled evidence that suggested a coordinated effort between pharmaceutical manufacturers, insurance companies, and regulatory bodies to suppress cheaper alternatives while driving up the cost of life-saving medication. The scope? Potentially billions in profits siphoned from vulnerable patients and national healthcare systems alike. That testimony never came. Instead, investigators found themselves at a crime scene that defied the neat narrative of domestic tragedy. Forensic experts determined the Shermans' injuries were inconsistent with suicide. Their bodies were positioned identically, arms bound behind their backs, feet placed side by side, necks compressed in a way that suggested external force. No signs of a struggle, no suicide note, no history of depression or discord. Private investigators hired by the Sherman family unearthed chilling findings. The couple had likely been restrained and tortured before death. Neck wounds didn't align with a fall or self-inflicted trauma. Some evidence, including surveillance footage from neighboring properties, simply disappeared after being confiscated by authorities. And then came the silence. The case, once buzzing with media attention, faded. The investigation quietly shifted from homicide to financial crimes. Leads went cold. Witnesses stopped speaking. Documents vanished. The timing was everything. Had Sherman lived 2 more days, his testimony could have triggered one of the most significant corporate accountability cases in Canadian history. Estimates suggest that the pharmaceutical industry stood to lose over $50 billion in fines, stock collapses, and class action lawsuits. Instead, with Barry gone, the trail of accountability evaporated. What remains is not just an unsolved double murder. It's a question that hangs in the air, unanswered. When a man with access to billions in secrets decides to speak, who gets to decide whether his story is ever heard? The Shermans were mourned in public, but in private, their death served as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what can happen when one family stands in the way of an industry built on silence and profit. They weren't the only ones. Next, we travel south to a prison cell in Manhattan where a man with a black book full of secrets would never make it to trial. The walls of the Metropolitan Correctional Center were meant to contain the untouchable, but on the humid morning of August 10, 2019, they contained something else, an absence. Jeffrey Epstein, financier, socialite, and convicted sex offender, was found dead in his cell. The official report called it suicide by hanging. Few believed it. For years, Epstein had been more than a money man. He was a connector, a broker of access between billionaires, politicians, scientists, and royalty. His mansions were playgrounds for the elite, but beneath the luxury was rot, a network of exploitation, power, and control. And most damning of all, it was recorded. Hidden cameras were found in his properties, every room, every corner, thousands of hours of footage, hard drives labeled and stored with meticulous precision. Those files, according to investigators, captured prominent figures in compromising situations with minors. Presidents, princes, CEOs, the kind of people who shape nations and markets. When Epstein was arrested in 2019, the world waited for the trial that might finally expose how power operates in the shadows. But that day never came. In the weeks leading up to his death, Epstein had begun cooperating with prosecutors. He hinted that he could name names, powerful ones, and trade information for protection. His lawyers described him as hopeful, even confident. But then, in a sequence of extraordinary coincidences, every safeguard around him collapsed. The cameras outside his cell stopped recording. The guards assigned to watch him fell asleep at the same time. His cellmate was abruptly transferred. The suicide watch, in place just days earlier, was mysteriously lifted. When his body was discovered, the injuries told a story that clashed with the official account. Broken bones in his neck, more consistent with strangulation than hanging. The morning after, the world's reaction was instant and polarized. Social media exploded. Late-night hosts joked about cover-ups. Politicians issued sterile condolences. But beneath the noise was something quieter and more unsettling. A realization that the truth, whatever it was, had been buried with him. Federal agents raided Epstein's private island and New York townhouse, seizing computers, documents, and photographs. But none of it was made public. Requests for transparency were denied under the banner of national security. The survivors were left with silence, the witnesses with fear, the accused with their reputations intact. And so a man whose life's work was manipulation, of wealth, of desire, of power, ended exactly as he had lived, surrounded by secrets. What did he know? Who did he threaten? And who, among the powerful, breathed easier the morning his body was found? Epstein's death didn't just close a case. It preserved a system that protects its architects, that ensures certain truths never see daylight, the kind of system where the walls don't just keep prisoners in, they keep the truth out. As one former prosecutor said, if he had lived, he could have taken down half of Washington and Wall Street. Instead, he took his secrets with him. But history has a way of echoing, and just 2 years later, another man with dangerous data, this time not of flesh and scandal, but of code and surveillance, would meet a strangely similar fate in a prison cell thousands of miles away. The cell was cold, quiet, and far from home. On June 23, 2021, John McAfee, the eccentric tech pioneer who built one of the world's most recognizable antivirus empires, was found dead in a Spanish prison. Officials ruled it suicide. But those who knew McAfee and those who understood what he was about to reveal never accepted that answer. Hours before his death, a Spanish court approved his extradition to the United States. He was facing charges of tax evasion, but McAfee's warnings suggested something deeper. For months, he had been claiming he possessed a trove of digital evidence, an insurance policy he called his dead man switch. It was designed to automatically release if he failed to check in. That switch never activated. What McAfee had long suspected and publicly stated was that surveillance wasn't limited to intelligence agencies anymore. He believed governments were working hand in glove with major tech firms to track, manipulate, and monetize the public under the guise of security. His antivirus software, he later confessed, had become a backdoor tool, an unintentional gateway for global spying. Paranoid? Maybe, but not without reason. In his final years, McAfee had turned to blockchain technology, working on a decentralized platform that could allow anonymous communication and currency exchange, systems outside the control of banks and regulators. He believed in digital freedom, and he believed powerful institutions were afraid of it. He also claimed to have uncovered market manipulation on a global scale. According to McAfee, central banks and state actors were suppressing cryptocurrency markets while quietly acquiring digital assets behind the scenes. The system, he said, was rigged, and he had the data to prove it. Then, abruptly, he was gone. Spanish authorities reported that McAfee had hung himself with a bedsheet, but fellow inmates later claimed they heard scuffling, raised voices, even muffled cries the night before. Surveillance footage? Corrupted. Backups? Missing. And in a move that raised even more eyebrows, his body was cremated within 48 hours before family or legal teams could request a second autopsy. The most haunting detail? As soon as news of his death broke, McAfee's secure servers, all of them, went offline simultaneously. These were systems he had spent years building, systems allegedly containing the very documents he promised would shake the foundations of the digital world, gone in an instant. In his last social media posts, McAfee warned of enemies closing in. He wrote cryptic notes about government plots, hidden files, and insurance folders titled simply Q. In one tweet, he said, "If I die, I didn't do it." The message was chilling. The silence that followed, even more so. John McAfee wasn't a saint. He was messy, brilliant, unpredictable. But he was also a man who dared to tug at the threads of systems most people never see: financial control, mass surveillance, digital censorship. And whether through hubris or heroism, he pushed too far. What happened in that prison cell may never be known. But the echoes of McAfee's warnings still bounce through digital corridors. The kind of warnings that suggest the war for privacy, freedom, and truth isn't on the battlefield. It's in the code. And those who try to expose it, they don't always make it out alive. Next, we return to California, where a former pharma executive turned activist uncovered something far more human and far more dangerous: the hidden cost of a public health system built on silence. In a modest California home, the light of a laptop screen glowed late into the night. Dr. Brandy Vien, once a pharmaceutical executive, had left the corporate world behind, but not the knowledge she carried. On December 8, 2020, she was found dead. Officially, it was natural causes, but those closest to her had a different name for it: a warning. Years earlier, Brandy had worked for one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. She'd seen the inside, how clinical trials were framed, how side effects were buried in paperwork, how regulators were persuaded with gifts and influence. What she witnessed changed her. She walked away. And then she began to speak. She founded an organization called Learn the Risk. Its purpose was not to fuel fear, but to push for transparency. Brandy focused on vaccine safety, not as a skeptic, but as someone who believed science should serve people, not profit. She revealed documents showing that certain adverse effects had been known and ignored. That data was manipulated to secure approvals. That systems meant to protect the public were, in some cases, shielding the companies instead. Her research struck a nerve. One analysis revealed that the CDC's vaccine injury reporting system might be capturing less than 1% of real adverse events. Other data suggested that vaccine injuries were being underreported by orders of magnitude, facts that, if widely known, could have changed public discourse entirely. As her platform grew, so did the pressure. She began receiving anonymous threats. Cars lingered outside her house. Her home was broken into multiple times, nothing stolen, but things moved. Subtle messages, she believed, meant to unsettle her. She documented it all, on social media, in private messages. She made videos stating clearly, "I am not suicidal. I am healthy. If anything happens to me, it wasn't by my hand." Then she was gone. She was just 47, fit, vibrant, and passionate. The cause of death? A rare cardiac episode, unexplained, with no prior warning. Her family's request for an independent autopsy was denied. Toxicology results were withheld. Within days, her organization's website vanished from the internet. Her videos disappeared. Her data archives wiped. It was as if someone had pressed delete, not just on her life, but on her legacy. What makes Brandy's story different is how personal it feels. She wasn't a billionaire or a global icon. She was a mother, a woman who believed that truth, real, verifiable, uncomfortable truth, could empower people to make informed choices. But truth is heavy, and sometimes it costs too much. Her death sparked outrage, but without evidence, without answers, there was little the public could do. The system moved on. The silence resumed. And the warnings she left behind remained scattered, half erased, yet undeniable. When people say one voice can make a difference, they often mean it as inspiration. In Brandy's case, it may have been what made her dangerous. One voice, backed by knowledge and courage, can shake the illusion of safety. And when that illusion crumbles, those who profit from it may do anything to put it back together. Next, we follow the trail east to Delaware, where a former Pentagon official uncovered billions in shadow funds and found himself at the bottom of a landfill. The landfill in Wilmington, Delaware is a strange place to end a life, a place for refuse, not for men who once walked the corridors of power. But on December 31, 2010, that's where John P. Wheeler III was found. A decorated Vietnam veteran, Pentagon consultant, and former White House aide, Wheeler had spent his career navigating the highest levels of American power. He also knew where the money went. Wheeler was a quiet force behind major national defense programs. He'd helped develop policies on cyber warfare, military ethics, and nuclear deterrence. But in the final years of his life, he turned his attention to something different: contracts. Specifically, contracts that didn't add up. He had stumbled upon irregularities in Pentagon budgeting. Contracts were being padded. Shell companies appeared and vanished. Wheeler believed he'd uncovered a massive laundering operation, one that funneled billions of taxpayer dollars through private contractors, defense companies, and offshore accounts. At the center of it, major U.S. banks and defense contractors. Wheeler had evidence: emails, spreadsheets, internal communications. He planned to bring it to federal investigators and members of Congress. But as the new year approached, his behavior grew erratic. He told close friends he was being followed, that his phones were tapped, that he feared something was coming. Then he disappeared. Surveillance footage showed him wandering in downtown Wilmington days before his body was discovered. He looked disoriented, shaken, far from the composed figure colleagues remembered. His body was later found at the landfill, badly bruised. The autopsy revealed blunt force trauma, suggesting assault. But officials dismissed foul play. They couldn't, or wouldn't, explain how he ended up there. Within days, the congressional inquiry Wheeler was preparing for was shelved. Federal investigators he'd been working with were reassigned. His files were seized and classified. The story slipped into obscurity. Some said he'd had a breakdown. Others whispered of black operations and internal retaliation. But nothing definitive ever surfaced. The case remained open, then quietly inactive. It wasn't just the brutality of his death that raised questions. It was the erasure. A man with access to the nation's deepest vaults of knowledge, gone, and every door he tried to open shut tight behind him. Wheeler's life embodied the paradox of public service, how those who speak truth from within the system can be the ones it consumes. He wasn't a whistleblower by nature. He was an institutionalist, a believer in reform. But belief, no matter how grounded, can't protect against the machinery of silence. And so his final message was never delivered, his data never analyzed, his suspicions never confirmed, except by the place his body was found and what it might represent. A dumping ground. Sometimes it's not the file that disappears. It's the person who dared to carry it. From the halls of the Pentagon, we now shift to the neon-lit offices of the early Internet, where one young man tried to set information free and paid the highest price. Brooklyn in January is gray, unforgiving. On the morning of January 11, 2013, Aaron Swartz was found hanging in his apartment. He was 26 years old, a programming prodigy, a co-founder of Reddit, a passionate advocate for open access to knowledge, and a young man caught in the crosshairs of something much larger than himself. Aaron had spent his short life challenging the idea that information should be locked away. He believed knowledge was a public good, that research, science, and government documents should be available to all, not just to the privileged or powerful. It wasn't just idealism. It was code. It was action. And it terrified people in power. At the time of his death, Aaron was facing up to 35 years in prison. His crime? Downloading millions of academic articles from JSTOR using MIT's network. The goal, according to friends, was to release them to the public. He wasn't selling them. He wasn't profiting. He was protesting a system that put barriers between knowledge and the people who needed it. But there was more beneath the surface. Aaron had been digging into something else, something darker. He was investigating the links between major tech companies and government surveillance programs. He had discovered that user data, emails, searches, messages, was being quietly shared with federal agencies. He was building a presentation that would expose how platforms people trusted were being turned into tools of control. Then came the pressure. Federal prosecutors hit him with aggressive charges, despite JSTOR choosing not to press for punishment. He was offered plea deals that would require admitting guilt and accepting prison time. Friends said he was exhausted, cornered, yet determined. He had told many people he wasn't suicidal, that he was ready to fight, that he believed in what he was doing. Then, silence. No note, no final message, just a young life full of potential abruptly ended. The outcry was immediate, from tech communities, from lawmakers, from academics who owed him their platforms. But no official ever stepped down. No apology was issued. The files he planned to release never surfaced. And the questions he was asking about surveillance, transparency, and control slipped back into the shadows. Aaron's death was not just a tragedy. It was a warning. It showed how the system responds to those who challenge it, not with debate, but with isolation, not with dialogue, but with punishment. He was not the first to be silenced by pressure, but he may have been the youngest, the most brilliant, the most heartbreaking. His story reminds us that change often begins with simple questions. Why is this information hidden? Who benefits from keeping it that way? And what happens when one voice dares to make it public? Next, we turn to a different kind of pioneer, a man whose innovations in energy technology could have made communities independent, and in doing so, threatened the heart of global power grids. It was a quiet July night in 1994 when Gary Kildall, a computer pioneer once poised to rival Bill Gates, walked into a bar in Monterey, California, and never walked out the same. Days later, he was dead. The cause, officially, was head trauma from a fall. But those who knew Gary and what he was working on suspected something far more sinister. Kildall is best remembered for creating CP/M, one of the earliest operating systems for personal computers. But his later work may have been even more groundbreaking. He had turned his attention to energy, specifically software that could allow homes and businesses to trade electricity peer-to-peer, bypassing traditional utility companies entirely. It was the beginning of what we now call the smart grid, but Kildall's vision went further. He imagined communities free from centralized control, generating and managing their own energy with precision and fairness. His platform could balance loads, store excess, and reroute power during peak times, all through code. And that scared a lot of people. The implications were massive. If adopted, his technology could have disrupted the entire energy sector, undermining profits, dismantling monopolies, and transferring power, literally and figuratively, to the people. Major energy corporations attempted to buy him out. He refused. He believed the technology belonged to everyone. Then came the night at the bar. Witnesses reported strange men in suits trailing Kildall that evening. Some said they didn't look like locals. Others noted that they left immediately after Gary's injury without helping. The medical report said he had fallen and hit his head. But the injury patterns didn't align with a single impact. There were signs of multiple blows, suggesting not an accident, but an assault. Still, the case was closed. No further investigation, no suspects. Shortly after his death, Kildall's lab was broken into. Computers containing his energy software were stolen. Not ransacked, surgically cleared. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were looking for: The timing was too clean. Kildall had planned to release his software as open source, free, global, a gift to a planet in climate crisis. Instead, the project vanished. His name faded from headlines, and the world's energy systems stayed exactly as they were. The tragedy wasn't just in his death, it was in the silence that followed. Gary Kildall wasn't a political figure or a radical activist. He was a scientist, an inventor, a man who believed technology could empower the average person, and for that, he may have paid with his life. Today, smart grid technologies exist, but many are proprietary, limited, or controlled by the same corporations he hoped to liberate us from. The dream of energy independence remains out of reach for most. Was it coincidence? A tragic fall? Or was it something else? A quiet elimination of a threat to the status quo. Some stories fade, others are buried, and some, like Kildall's, sit uneasily in both categories. Next, we head back into the world of media, where one journalist, days away from exposing government manipulation of the press, met a fiery end on a dark Los Angeles street. The engine roared in the early hours of June 18, 2013. A silver Mercedes tore through the streets of Los Angeles before slamming into a palm tree and erupting into flames. The man inside was Michael Hastings, investigative journalist, author, and a relentless voice of dissent. Hours earlier, he had emailed his colleagues saying he was onto something big. Then he was gone. Hastings had made enemies before. His 2010 Rolling Stone article had led to the resignation of a four-star general. He wasn't afraid to ask hard questions or publish uncomfortable truths. But in the months leading to his death, he was chasing a story more dangerous than anything he'd done before. He was investigating ties between intelligence agencies and mainstream media, how narratives were shaped, how dissent was silenced, and how public opinion could be quietly steered by hidden hands. He was digging into Operation Mockingbird, a Cold War-era program where the CIA had planted operatives inside major newsrooms. Hastings believed the operation hadn't ended. It had evolved. His research pointed to digital propaganda, AI-driven bot networks, fake social media accounts, and coordinated disinformation campaigns. He had uncovered evidence that intelligence agencies were influencing what stories trended, what voices were amplified, and which were erased. It wasn't censorship in the traditional sense. It was something more subtle, more effective. He told friends he was being followed, that his car had been tampered with, that he needed to go off the radar. And then his car exploded. The crash was violent, too violent. Firefighters struggled to extinguish the blaze. Witnesses said the car accelerated moments before impact, as if someone else was at the wheel. Experts later testified that modern vehicles, especially those with computer-assisted driving, can be remotely accessed, even controlled. No mechanical issues were found, no trace of alcohol or drugs, no evidence of braking. His final email, sent hours before his death, warned of federal agents investigating him. He urged his team to secure sensitive documents. That story, the one he said would blow the lid off, was never published. His hard drives and research materials were seized by authorities. The official cause? Accident. But those close to him never believed it. They remembered a man full of purpose, a father, a husband, a fighter. Not reckless, not suicidal, determined. Michael Hastings believed journalism was a public duty, not a performance. He saw the role of the press as a check on power, and that belief may have cost him everything. His death was not just the loss of a reporter. It was the extinguishing of a light aimed into the darkest corners of governance and media, and in its place, once again, silence. The story he tried to tell remains untold. But the questions linger. Who controls the narrative? And what happens to those who try to rewrite it? Next, we travel back to the 1970s, where a young technician with a stack of documents and a conscience dared to expose radioactive negligence. Her name was Karen Silkwood, Oklahoma, in '74. The headlights cut through the darkness as Karen Silkwood drove along a rural highway, her car packed with documents, proof of something toxic, something buried. She never made it to her meeting. Her car veered off the road and slammed into a concrete culvert. When authorities arrived, the papers were gone. Karen wasn't a politician or a journalist. She was a lab technician at the Kerr-McGee plutonium plant. Her job was to monitor health and safety procedures in a facility that produced fuel for nuclear reactors. What she found changed her life, and may have ended it. Contamination was everywhere. Workers were exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. Safety protocols were ignored. Records were falsified. And Karen had the evidence to prove it. She began collecting documents, memos, lab results, internal warnings that were never acted upon. She joined a union safety committee and started speaking out. The company tried to silence her, but she kept going. She knew what was at stake. Not just her co-workers, but entire communities living near nuclear facilities. Then the contamination hit home, literally. Karen's body began testing positive for high levels of plutonium. Her apartment, her car, even her toothbrush were radioactive. Yet she hadn't been working in the contaminated areas. Something was wrong. Either the safety systems had completely failed, or someone had deliberately poisoned her. Still, she pressed on. She arranged a meeting with a New York Times reporter and a union official. She said she had documents that would blow the lid off the company's negligence. But she never arrived. Her car was found off the road. The driver's side door was damaged. Paint scratches suggested another vehicle had forced her off the highway. The crash, though severe, wasn't enough to kill her outright. Yet she was dead. And the documents, nowhere to be found. The investigation raised more questions than it answered. No autopsy was performed. The scene wasn't treated as suspicious. Authorities moved quickly to close the case. Kerr-McGee denied all allegations, but under public pressure, they eventually closed their nuclear division and paid a settlement to Silkwood's family without admitting fault. Karen became a symbol, a whistleblower before the word became common, a woman who risked everything to expose a system that prioritized profit over safety. Her story inspired books, movies, and congressional hearings, but it also became a cautionary tale about how far institutions will go to protect themselves, about how dangerous the truth can be, and how easily it can disappear. Karen Silkwood's life ended on a dark road in the middle of nowhere, but her message still burns, like the radioactive dust she tried to contain. Next, we turn to a modern case. A doctor who believed autism had a cause, and that the cause might lie in our most trusted public health programs. His name was Jeff Bradstreet, a quiet river in North Carolina. That's where Dr. Jeff Bradstreet was found on June 19, 2015, face down in the water, a gunshot wound to his chest. Official reports labeled it suicide, but for many, especially the families he helped, that conclusion raised more questions than it answered. Bradstreet was more than a doctor. He was a researcher, a father, and a controversial figure in the world of autism treatment. He believed autism wasn't purely genetic, that it could be triggered or worsened by environmental factors. Chief among them, vaccines. For years, Bradstreet had explored connections between vaccine ingredients, like mercury and aluminum, and neurological damage in children. His methods weren't always mainstream, but his results were striking. Using detoxification therapies, he had helped thousands of children improve in ways conventional medicine said was impossible. His clinic, tucked away in Georgia, became a haven for parents desperate for hope. But it also made him a target. Just days before his death, federal agents raided his offices. Patient records, treatment protocols, and years of research were seized. The stated reason? Alleged use of unapproved therapies. But many in the alternative medicine community believed it was about something deeper, silencing a voice that was gaining too much traction. Bradstreet had recently begun researching an enzyme called nagalase. He believed it was interfering with the body's immune response and that its presence might be linked to rising rates of chronic illness. More controversially, he suspected nagalase might be introduced through vaccines, compromising the body's ability to fight disease. These claims were explosive. If proven, they could have rewritten the public health narrative and exposed massive liability for pharmaceutical companies. Then suddenly, he was gone. The circumstances were strange. Bradstreet was right-handed, but the gunshot entered from the left. The weapon was never found. No suicide note. No witnesses. The riverbanks yielded no clues. Private investigators hired by the family found inconsistencies in the police report and the autopsy. Within weeks, other holistic doctors researching similar topics were also found dead under equally mysterious conditions. The pattern was chilling. Bradstreet's family never believed he took his own life. Neither did the thousands of parents who credited him with changing their children's lives. They remembered a man who was hopeful, engaged, and planning his next research breakthrough. His death didn't just silence a medical voice. It extinguished a lifeline for families left adrift by a system that offered little help and no answers. And just like that, the research disappeared. The treatments were discredited. The conversation, once growing, was cut short. Whether you agreed with Bradstreet or not, his story reveals something unsettling. When someone challenges the foundation of an industry, especially one as powerful as medicine, they often don't get to finish their sentence. Next, we look back at the broader picture. 10 deaths, 10 stories, one chilling pattern, and the question that ties them all together. What are we really allowed to know? There's a rhythm to these stories, a pulse beneath the tragedy, a voice interrupted, a revelation erased. Again and again, individuals who stood at the edge of truth met abrupt, untimely ends. Not criminals, not fringe theorists, but insiders, experts, innovators, billionaires who disrupted entire industries, scientists who questioned the official narrative, journalists who reached too deep, developers who built tools to free information from centralized control. What binds them isn't just how they died, it's what they were about to say. In each case, we find a familiar arc. Someone uncovers something dangerous, they speak up or plan to, and then they vanish. Official reports follow. Suicide, accident, natural causes, cases close, files disappear, questions linger. The deeper you look, the more uniform the silence becomes. With Barry Sherman, it was a billion-dollar price-fixing scheme. With Epstein, it was a black book full of names too powerful to name. With McAfee, it was a blueprint of financial manipulation and global surveillance. With Brandy Vaughan and Jeff Bradstreet, it was the suggestion that public health may not always be guided by public interest. Each story feels isolated, but in the quiet spaces between them, a pattern forms. Power is not always about what you can say. Sometimes it's about what others can't. These weren't just individuals, they were pressure points. And when pressure builds in the wrong place, systems respond swiftly, decisively, often with finality. That's what makes these deaths more than personal tragedies. They're red flags. They show us the limits of inquiry, the places where even the most credentialed, the most connected, the most careful meet resistance too strong to overcome. And so we're left with echoes. A scheduled testimony that never happens, a manuscript that disappears, a server that goes offline the minute someone dies. We don't need conspiracies to explain these events. The truth is often simpler and far more unsettling. In any system designed to maintain stability, those who threaten that stability will be neutralized. not always through violence, sometimes through discrediting, through marginalization, but sometimes through silence of the most permanent kind. It raises uncomfortable questions. How much truth can a society tolerate? What happens when evidence becomes too costly to acknowledge? And in a world increasingly built on data, who decides which data lives and which dies? As we near the end of this journey, it's time to stop seeing these cases as isolated anomalies. They're markers, signposts along the road to understanding how knowledge, when dangerous enough, is treated not as a gift, but as a threat. Next, we arrive at the final chapter, a reflection on what these stories tell us, not just about power, but about humanity, about the value of truth, and the price we pay when we bury it. The thread has run through boardrooms, laboratories, prison cells, and quiet back roads. It's woven into corporate memos, corrupted hard drives, missing testimonies, and voices silenced just before they were heard. 10 stories, 10 lives, each one a flash of truth extinguished before its full light could reach the world. What are we left with? Not just suspicion, not just fear, but a deeper awareness that the systems we depend on, legal, corporate, medical, governmental, have boundaries. Invisible walls. And when someone tries to cross them, they're often met with more than resistance. They're met with consequences. But let's step back, because the real question isn't just what these people knew, it's why we were never allowed to hear it. There is a difference between a theory and a pattern. A theory asks for proof. A pattern asks for recognition. And once you've seen this pattern, the same beats repeating, the same outcomes dressed in different clothes, you can't unsee it. A man schedules testimony. He dies. A woman collects evidence. It vanishes. A researcher builds a platform to share information. The servers go dark. A journalist writes that his car has been tampered with. Hours later, he's dead. If this happened once, we might call it coincidence. Twice, tragedy. But 10 times? Across industries, decades, continents? That's no longer coincidence. That's a mechanism. We are not claiming certainty, but we are claiming urgency. Because every story here represents not just a loss of life, but a loss of knowledge. A dead man can't testify. A silenced researcher can't warn the public. A deleted server can't challenge the narrative. And this is the point. When power is threatened, it doesn't need to win the argument. It only needs to outlast the opponent. Delay, distract, dismiss. And if that fails, disappear. This isn't paranoia. It's pattern recognition. But perhaps the most disturbing piece isn't what's been done to the whistleblowers, the scientists, or the journalists. It's what hasn't been done in response. The lack of outrage, the fading headlines, the comfortable forgetting. Silence, in this context, isn't just the result, it's the goal. So what do we do with that? We remember. We connect the dots. We keep asking the hard questions, not because we expect clear answers, but because the act of asking is itself a kind of defiance. And we honor those who risked everything to show us what they saw. Even if we never get to see the full picture, in the final part, we'll return to the beginning, to the quiet that follows these stories, and to the challenge that remains for all of us, to find a way to protect those who carry truth, before truth becomes too dangerous to survive. It ends where it began, in silence. But this time, it's a silence filled with knowing, with names, with faces, with stories that refuse to be forgotten. Barry Sherman, Jeffrey Epstein, John McAfee, Brandy Vaughn, John Wheeler, Aaron Swartz, Gary Kildall, Michael Hastings, Karen Silkwood, Jeff Bradstreet. 10 individuals, 10 lives interrupted, 10 reasons to look closer at the systems that surround us. We often think of truth as something invincible, something that can't be destroyed. But truth is fragile when it's held in human hands. It depends on people willing to carry it, to protect it, to share it. And those people are vulnerable. If we've learned anything from these stories, it's that knowing too much can be dangerous. Speaking too loudly can be fatal. And trusting that the truth will always prevail on its own, that's a comforting illusion. The truth needs protection. The people who carry it need protection. Not just legal protections, but cultural ones. A society that values transparency more than image, that honors whistleblowers not as troublemakers, but as guardians of the public interest, that recognizes the cost of silence, not just to individuals, but to all of us. Because when we lose someone who dared to speak up, we don't just lose a voice. We lose possibilities. The possibility of a safer medicine, a cleaner energy future, a freer internet, an honest government, a better world. And so the challenge is left with us. Will we listen more closely the next time someone speaks hard truths? Will we resist the comfort of the official story and ask instead, who benefits from this version of events? Will we protect those who protect us, not with weapons, but with information? Or will we continue to watch the same story unfold again and again until it's no longer surprising? Truth can't thrive in darkness. It needs light. It needs witnesses. It needs people willing to remember. As the noise of the world swells, feeds, headlines, reactions, there's value in slowing down, in remembering the stories that almost disappeared, not to chase shadows, but to understand what happens when power is challenged. And what it means, truly, to live in a world where knowledge is power, and power will stop at nothing to protect itself. The question that echoes through this series is simple but profound. How many more voices must be silenced before we finally learn to listen? Until then, the silence remains, not empty, but waiting.